Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you again to the September 2017 focus, All Creatures Great and Small in Their Natural Habitats. I'll get to speaking properly today. It's still morning. This focus, again, is for the Natural History Illustration 2016 Students Facebook group. And again, I'm using Google Hangouts because it's going to take 3 weeks for me to get a battery for my video camera. So we're just going to do this via slideshow. Week 2A is all about measuring and keeping correct proportions in your artwork. If you've completed the week 1 or step 1, the choices section, you can jump right into week 2, but please finish week 1 completely before starting. The Natural History Illustration 101 course we took discussed learning to see as an artist so that we could accurately depict natural world subjects. Proportion is the key to accuracy. Thankfully, proportion is not a style or a technique. It's a measurement or a ratio that can be used to plan a composition or to draw a subject, live or from a photograph. Once you learn how to measure correct proportions, it will become just one of the tools that you can create a beautiful and technically correct work of art. This week, or the beginning of the week, you will transfer your chosen image using your choice of the comparative measuring tools. In this section, we're covering gridding. So be brave and post your choices to our Facebook group along with either your photo reference or a photo of what you are live drawing. Don't forget to photograph your steps as you create the creature in its habitat. Did you already choose a frame for your finished artwork? In this focus, we plan to actually display or finish our work, not hide it in the nearest closet. So if you haven't already chosen a frame, I suggest you go and find a frame to match the size of your finished artwork. Acrylic and oil paintings don't need a glass and are usually thicker to accommodate the thickness of the canvas or board. Paper should be framed behind glass and separated from the glass by a mat. Try not to use a projector of any kind when transferring an image. I never use a projector, and it isn't because that method of transferring an image is cheating. Projectors have been around for many, many years, but there is a problem with lenses when projecting an image. Lenses are round, and light bends at the edges of the picture. So an image projected through the lens will bend, and it is especially noticeable when increasing to a very large size. A better way to increase the size is to use the following tools. The first one this week is gridding. In this focus, you will learn what types of grids are used by artists. You will learn the pros and cons of using a grid to transfer an image. You will learn how to draw a grid and transfer the exact same grid to your art surface. And you will learn how to transfer an image from a reference photo to your art surface. Now, this can also be from live drawing to an art surface. What types of grids are used by artists? The grid method is more than just copying. The grid is a tool that can be used to create lines, curves, and angles in correct proportion. Different artists use different grids, and often they create their own design. One artist that has had a unique grid design style was the famous Canadian war artist, Alex Colville. He used gridding to check perspective and to place focal points. It's more than a method of sketching. rather than using a pre-planned grid. It evolves as the drawing takes place. This is the resulting painting from the previous design. Andrew Loomis books are great for learning human proportions through gridding. And the square grid to transfer an image from a photo to another two-dimensional surface. An image can be transferred with this method to canvas, paper, a flat block of wood, for sculpting. The advantage of gridding is that it can be increased to any size, even mural size. It can also be used to decrease size. The modified grid can be used and is simple. Connect the outer corners of your square grid. Or just draw an X from corner to corner of a pre-drawn square or rectangle, or your piece of paper. The grid must be drawn the same way on your photo reference and on your art surface. Circular grids. Circular grids can be used alone or inside a square grid to help visualize an area of focus. These are usually drawn on tracing paper, as the final image is usually too complicated to transfer to the art surface. The rule of thirds grids. Artists also use a grid of 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines, creating 9 squares to help them with composition. It's called the rule of thirds grid and divides a picture into thirds. And the resulting intersections, the 4 dots, are where you will place focal points. The human brain likes to see things in threes. If you divide a photo into 3 and then place 3 focal points out of this, in other words, 3 of the 4 dots, the result will be a pleasing picture. For example, this bird photo needs to be cropped on 2 sides to fit the rule of thirds grid. The 3 focal points, the eye, breast, and feet, or the butt, fit on the dots, and the last dot is left free. It was the Renaissance painters who found that the eye doesn't rest on the center of a painting. Instead, the eye wants to roam with a subject, and so they found a way to lead the eye around a painting. Placing the focal points at these points makes the eye follow them around and around and around, never leaving the painting. The pros and cons of using a grid to transfer an image. The problem with gridding is the grid lines have to be erased or covered. Different art mediums have different ways of dealing with that problem. The easiest way is to erase the grid once the image is transferred, but this can cause problems with watercolor paper, pastel paper, or charcoal papers that have a special coating or tooth in the paper. You must use very light lines if you're going to use a grid on watercolor paper, and then erase the lines carefully, or you can grid onto tracing paper and then transfer the final image to the art surface using some type of graphite paper. Erasing can also destroy the tooth of heavier drawing papers. But acrylic and oil painters must either erase the grid once the image has been transferred or paint right over the grid with opaque paint. Now you've got to know that some acrylic and oil paints are transparent and the grid would still show through. What happens after you've erased the grid and then you find a mistake? Let's say you notice an eye looks too large and you are almost finished the picture. How do you check the size when you've erased the grid? So you can see that although gridding may seem like the simplest way to transfer an image, it has drawbacks. And I suggest you grid onto tracing paper and then transfer the final image to your art surface. if you can't find a way to erase those lines completely. What tools will you need to make a grid? The only tools you'll need for gridding are a pencil, a ruler, and a calculator to increase size. I'm not good at math, but if you're good at math, you don't need the calculator. And you need to know that a metric ruler is much easier to use than a standard ruler if you need calculation changes to increase or decrease size, because a metric ruler has divisions of 10, which are really easy to calculate. Alternately, you can use an online app to grid the photo for you. You have to add the grid to your own art surface, but the app will put the grid onto your image. We've included a link with the focus files. To grid, you'll have to be drawing directly on your photo or a photocopy of your photo, so make sure you have at least 2 copies of the image you want to use. Decide where to place your focal points using the rule of thirds. I always start in my mind where I want to place the focal points of my painting. Here's my first reference photo that I'll be doing for the focus. And remember, I need more than one image printed out to actually draw on it. But if I use a computer or my cell phone with a grid on there, one. Now you may have to draw a rule of thirds grid, as previously described, onto tracing paper to help you visualize where you want to move the focal points. Or you can just imagine a grid like I do. I want the focus to be on the head of the moth, and as you can see, the top of the photo shows the focal points are not on my subject. That means I'm cropping the photo. If I had done the rule of thirds over the whole photo, the focal points wouldn't have been where I wanted them. So I had to shrink the rule of thirds grid to fit exactly where I wanted the focal points to fit. So I have to crop out anything that is beyond that grid. How to draw a grid and transfer it to your art surface. It's time to start drawing the first grid. You start by drawing on the photograph, not on your art paper or a photocopy of your photograph. That's why you have more than one photo printed out. One to draw on and one to use as a painting reference. Excuse me. The grid can be any size, but the horizontal and vertical lines must be the same distance apart to make the transferring easy. Example, you can have them 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter or 4 inches by 4 inches. It doesn't matter as long as the vertical and horizontal line spacing is the same. Artists find creating a grid with the same number of squares on the photo and their art paper difficult. There are steps you must follow to transfer the grid from the reference photo to the art surface. So number 1, count the number of squares on the longest side of your grid that you've drawn on your photograph. Grid has 8 squares on the longest size. Don't even worry about the short side yet. Next, measure the longest side of your art paper or your canvas or your other art support. Mine is a canvas. You're using a frame with a mat inside. The measurement you take is from the inside of the mat board on the longest side, not from the outside of the frame. Because remember, your artwork has to fit within the mat. Number 3, using that measurement from your canvas or your art paper, divide it by the number of squares you counted on the longest side of your photo grid. So example, if I have a canvas inches long on its longest side, and my photo grid has 8 squares on its longest side, then the calculation is 16 divided by 8 equals 2 inches. If I have a ruler with centimeters, the calculation is 40.6 centimeters divided by 8, 5.05 centimeters. And this is the new size of my squares that I will grid onto my art surface, horizontally and vertically, but I'm going to round it out to 5 centimeters, which is really easy. So every square will be 5 centimeters wide and 5 centimeters in height. Now it's time to grid onto whatever surface you are using. But remember, if you're using paper that would be framed with a mat, make sure you leave room at the top of the paper to attach it behind the mat. And I've got a diagram here that shows you how the mat will be attached to your art board and placed underneath the mat and your glass and your frame. You need to leave a little bit of room so you're not putting tape onto your paper where the drawing is. So leave some room at the top and the sides to fit under the mat. Now we're going to transfer the grid to the art surface. So this is transferring onto my canvas, but I'm doing this digitally on Photoshop right now. Take your new grid square calculation, remember mine is 5 centimeters, and begin at the top left-hand corner on your art surface. Top left-hand corner. You're going to measure from that corner in both directions, horizontally and vertically. And if you've done it correctly, perfect squares. And you have to add A, B, C, D, E, F, G at the top and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the side. That is how you're going to read your grid later on. And gridding is really helpful when increasing a photo to a mural size. This is me a few years ago, and I used a grid. I'm actually holding in my left hand a 4x6-inch photograph that I've gridded up to a 4x5 piece of canvas. To begin transferring your image, you need a space large enough to place your reference photo and your art surface in front of you. Or you can hold your reference photo in your hand while you draw. Let's assume we want to transfer one section of your photo that is labeled D3. You're going to find that same square on your art surface. Let's look at a simple line drawing to transfer. Find the square D3 on your photo reference and look only at that square while you draw. Do not get sidetracked looking at the rest of the image. You will draw exactly what you see, whether it makes sense or not. Our minds like to play tricks when we're drawing. So double check the line before moving on to the next. So we're going to use the small image and see exactly where the line is in D3. We're going to go over to the large image that you've increased on whatever art surface you have and draw that exact same shape. I like to think of in shape. Exact same shape or line on the large paper. And you can see here that I've used a line drawing just to make it easy for you to understand. Square at a time. And then once you've got one square done, you move on to the next square. Here is how I actually use photo grid transfer. I have both the reference photo showing and the canvas showing, just as I would in real life. I choose which square to start transferring. In this case, 4 squares at once. The gridding. First, I do a simple outline, and then I gradually fill in the color. I don't focus on anything but those 4 squares while I gradually add more detail. I need to paint more realistically, filling in all the details until done. And this is my real life drawing on canvas. It's a canvas covered board. I'm using a pastel pencil to draw the grid and the outline because I'm going to be oil painting on top. Drawing the grid took about 5 minutes, and the canvas. And then the image was transferred the grid as a line drawing. The drawback is that when the lines disappear, as soon as oil paint is applied, I'll have to paint away from the lines if I want to keep the image showing. So I'll be doing my painting along with you. I just wanted to show you how to transfer the grid. And gridding from life. Yes, you can grid from life if you build your own setup. You'll need a piece of glass or plexiglass, a ruler, a black permanent marker, and some kind of piece of wood or metal with a slot in it to hold up the glass. And it'll have to be attached to something like a tabletop to keep it from falling over. You draw the grid on your glass surface instead of your photograph, and you stand it up in front of you on its support. And it must be completely vertical, the tabletop you use. And then you sit behind it and you can look through it to draw. But you have to stay in the exact same place. If I do that, I put a little rock or something on the corner of my chair feet and make sure it stays in position. A move 1 or 2 inches in either direction will change your view through the grid. And historically, artists used a wire grid in a frame. A stick in front that attached to the tabletop that they actually placed their eye so that they would be in the exact same position every time they looked through it. Side grids will be covered in the next section, 2B, and I'm going to post that shortly. And you need to get ready for week 2B when we're going to look at proportional dividers, compasses, calipers, and pencil measuring. And if you haven't got a proportional divider, I've posted a video on the Facebook group of how to make your own. I made a bunch in one day, but you do not need a proportional divider if you don't. I just went out and got a school compass, which I will use to show you the easy way, but it is the same size method. A proportional divider will let you increase or decrease the size. And your homework for this part of the focus is to make a square grid on a photograph and transfer the grid to another piece of paper. And if you've never done gridding before, don't use your masterpiece canvas or art paper. Do a test. Get any photograph, draw the grid on it, transfer it to a plain piece of paper just for a test if it's the first time you've ever done it. But if you're familiar with gridding and don't want to do any homework, you can wait for the next step to transfer the images using a divider. And that's going to be posted shortly. And we'd like you to take a few pictures of your steps and post them to the Facebook group explaining what you did. And if you have other techniques for transferring an image, we'd like to hear them. Please share with us on the Facebook group. We'll be watching. So for now, let's get gridding, and thanks for watching.